Have you ever witnessed a leader so breathtakingly inept that their very presence in power feels like a cosmic joke at humanity's expense? Not just an ordinary incompetent, but someone whose every decision makes you question whether the universe itself is mocking us. A ruler so perfectly mismatched to their position that their ascendance defies all logic, all reason, all common sense. What you're seeing is no accident of history, but rather the inevitable outcome of a system where power doesn't filter for excellence. It filters for the absence of conscience. The great unspoken truth of civilization is this: competence is a handicap in the pursuit of power. The qualities that actually make someone good at governing, wisdom, foresight, ethical restraint, are the very traits that disqualify them from winning the vicious tournament of leadership. Meanwhile, the reckless, the narcissistic, the morally unburdened surge ahead precisely because they lack the inhibitions that would slow a better person down. It's not that good people can't gain power. It's that the system is chemically engineered to repel them. Machiavelli saw this with crystalline clarity 500 years ago when he observed that to understand how power really works, one must study what is done rather than what ought to be done. His infamous treatise was less a prescription than an autopsy, cutting open the corpse of political reality to reveal the maggots of human nature feasting within. The uncomfortable truth he exposed remains unchanged today. The game is rigged in favor of those willing to cheat, not because evil always triumphs, but because the rules of power systematically eliminate anyone unwilling to play dirty. Consider the brutal efficiency of this mechanism. While the wise hesitate, weighing consequences, considering ethics, paralyzed by nuance, the fools charge ahead armed with nothing but audacity and a complete lack of self-awareness. Their very incompetence becomes their greatest asset in a world that rewards the appearance of confidence over actual capability. We've built societies that mistake swagger for strength, volume for validity, and stubbornness for wisdom. The result? A leadership class perfectly optimized for failure. This phenomenon transcends politics. It's encoded in the DNA of every human hierarchy. In corporations, the psychopath rises while the team player stagnates. In academia, the shameless self-promoter lands tenure while the careful researcher toils in obscurity. Even in families, the most demanding child commands the most attention. The system isn't broken, it's functioning exactly as designed, rewarding precisely the behaviors we claim to despise. What makes this more than just a cynical observation is the terrifying implication. We keep getting the leaders we deserve, not because we're unlucky, but because we're predictable. Our psychological wiring makes us lap up simple solutions to complex problems. Our social structures reward performative masculinity over quiet competence. Our institutions value the illusion of control more than actual governance. Until we confront why this keeps happening, why Machiavelli's observations remain as true in Silicon Valley as they were in Renaissance Florence, we remain trapped in what might be called the idiot's paradox. The dumber our leaders act, the more we trust their apparent confidence. The mechanisms that elevate fools to power operate with the ruthless precision of physical laws, governing human hierarchies as predictably as gravity governs falling objects. At the heart of this phenomenon lie three immutable principles that Machiavelli glimpsed through the fog of Renaissance politics, and which modern behavioral science has since confirmed with clinical precision. These are not mere observations about bad leadership, but fundamental rules about how power actually distributes itself in human systems, regardless of era or culture. The first law states that the likelihood of gaining power is inversely proportional to one's scruples. This is the brutal mathematics of dominance hierarchies. Every ethical constraint, every moral hesitation, every moment spent considering collateral damage represents friction in the machinery of ambition. The sociopath who views others as stepping stones will always outpace the conscientious leader who sees them as human beings. This explains why corporate psychopaths are 4 times more likely to reach executive positions than their empathetic peers, and why political systems consistently filter for what psychologists call dark triad traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. The system isn't malfunctioning when it produces such leaders. It's working exactly as designed. The second law reveals that competence creates friction where foolishness flows freely. Actual capability requires time, effort, and often unpopular decisions, all of which slow one's ascent. Meanwhile, the fool's complete lack of substantive knowledge becomes an unexpected asset, allowing them to pivot without cognitive dissonance. to promise impossibilities without hesitation, to project confidence untroubled by actual understanding. Modern neuroscience confirms this perverse advantage. The Dunning-Kruger effect ensures that the least competent are often the most confident, while true experts are paralyzed by the knowledge of what they don't know. In a world where perception trumps reality, this creates a perfect storm where the empty vessel makes the most noise. The third law, most devastating of all, demonstrates that systems naturally evolve to reward system gaming. Like a virus adapting to its host, ambitious fools inevitably discover and exploit the most efficient paths to power within any given hierarchy. This explains why different eras produce different flavors of incompetence. The medieval court jester becomes the modern talking head. The hereditary aristocrat becomes the legacy admission. But the underlying dynamics remain unchanged. Organizational theorists call this the iron law of oligarchy. All systems, no matter how idealistically conceived, eventually become optimized for seizing and retaining power rather than achieving their stated goals. The fools aren't breaking the system. They're simply its most perfect users. These three laws conspire to create what might be called the leadership paradox. The better someone would actually be at leading, the less likely they are to gain power in the first place. The wise are disqualified by their wisdom, the competent by their competence, the ethical by their ethics. Meanwhile, the system positively selects for the worst possible candidates, creating a perverse evolutionary pressure where each generation of leaders is more perfectly adapted to gaining power and less equipped to wield it responsibly. This explains why history appears as one long procession of blundering elites. It's not that humanity has bad luck with leaders, but that we've created systems where only bad leaders can succeed. The Roman emperors knew it. The Medici bankers perfected it. And today's corporate climbers and political operatives prove it anew each day. The tragedy isn't that fools occasionally stumble into power. It's that our systems make their ascendance mathematically inevitable. The archetype of the foolish ruler is not merely a modern frustration or a Renaissance observation. It is a thread woven deep into humanity's oldest stories, appearing again and again as if the collective unconscious has been trying to warn us for millennia. Consider the Tarot's fool, that carefree wanderer stepping blithely off a cliff, oblivious to the abyss below. He is not just a figure of comedy, but of prophecy, a representation of how power often falls to those too reckless to fear the fall. In mythology, we see the same pattern. The buffoonish kings of folklore, the trickster gods who stumble into dominion, the jesters who whisper uncomfortable truths while the wise rulers make disastrous decisions. These stories endure because they resonate with the truth we recognize but struggle to articulate. The world is not led by the wise, but by those best able to perform wisdom while evading its burdens. Take the ancient parable of the emperor's new clothes. The tale is often remembered as a lesson about childish honesty, but its deeper subtext is far more cynical. The swindlers who sell the invisible fabric are not the villains of the story. They are its realists, understanding that power is sustained by collective pretense. The courtiers who claim to see the non-existent robes are not cowards, but skilled players in a game where perception is everything. And the emperor himself, he is neither a fool nor a victim, but the perfect embodiment of leadership's central paradox. Those in charge often know least of all, yet depend entirely on others' willingness to pretend otherwise. The child who declares the truth is not celebrated but silenced, for the system cannot tolerate the revelation that its authority is naked. History offers its own grim pantheon of fools turned rulers. Caligula, who made his horse a senator, was not an aberration but an extreme example of a recurring type. The leader whose very absurdity becomes a perverse proof of their power. What does it say about authority when madness not only fails to disqualify one from wielding it, but can even strengthen one's grip? The answer lies in the unsettling reality that power is not about competence, but about the suspension of disbelief. The more outrageous the leader, the more their followers must contort their own judgment to justify loyalty, creating a feedback loop of devotion. This explains why cults of personalities so often form around the least substantial figures. The greater the gap between the leader's merits and their status, the more energy the system must expend to maintain the illusion, binding followers ever tighter to the collective fiction. Even religion and philosophy echo this theme. In Christianity, Paul writes that God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, a line that reads less like divine praise and more like bitter observation. Zen Buddhism's foolish wise man archetype, the one who appears simple but sees clearly, suggests that true understanding requires shedding the pretenses that power demands. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's madman announcing the death of God is not a prophet but a fool. The only figure free enough from societal constraints to voice what others dare not admit. These traditions converge on the same uncomfortable truth. The fool is often the only one permitted to speak truth to power, precisely because power dismisses them as harmless. But what happens when the fool ceases to be the court jester and becomes the king? Modernity has not escaped this dynamic. It has simply dressed it in new costumes. The celebrity's CEO who rockets to fame despite a trail of wreckage. The politician whose gaffes only endear them to supporters. The influencer who monetisers ignorance. All are heirs to the same ancient pattern. Social media has merely amplified the fool's advantage, creating a world where the loudest, brashest, and least substantive voices dominate simply because they best exploit the medium's addictive rhythms. The algorithm does not reward wisdom. It rewards engagement. And nothing engages like folly dressed as revelation. The through line is unmistakable. Civilization's most enduring stories keep returning to the fool in power not because we find it entertaining, but because we know it to be true. The question is not why this keeps happening, but why we keep pretending it shouldn't. Perhaps because to admit otherwise would force us to confront an even more terrifying possibility. That the fool doesn't corrupt the system, but is its purest product. The recognition that folly so often wears the crown presents us with a formidable challenge. How does one navigate a world where the rules of power seem deliberately designed to frustrate wisdom? This is not an academic question but a survival skill. For the systems we inhabit, from corporate ladders to political structures, all operate according to these ancient, unspoken laws. The first step is radical clarity. We must stop pretending these dynamics don't exist or hoping that merit will eventually triumph. History shows it rarely does unless consciously engineered to do so. The solution lies not in becoming fools ourselves, but in developing what might be called strategic integrity, the ability to maintain one's principles while understanding exactly how and when the system will punish them. Consider the workplace, that microcosm of power dynamics where the fool's advantage manifests daily. Research shows that narcissists are significantly more likely to be promoted than their more competent peers, not because they produce better results, but because they're better at claiming credit and shifting blame. The employee who quietly solves problems goes unnoticed while the one who loudly takes credit for others' work rises. This isn't an anomaly. It's the system working as designed. The wise response isn't to emulate this behavior, but to recognize that visibility is often more valuable than virtue in such environments. This doesn't require compromising ethics, but rather understanding that good work must be paired with strategic communication. Not because this is how it should be, but because this is how the game is played. The political arena offers even starker lessons. Studies of electoral outcomes consistently demonstrate that voters prefer confident candidates over competent ones, even when that confidence is completely unwarranted. The implications are terrifying. Democratic systems, theoretically designed to produce the best leaders, often function as perfect machines for selecting the most charismatic fools. This explains the rise of so-called political outsiders who leverage their very lack of experience as proof of their authenticity. The antidote isn't abandoning democracy, but reforming its structures to reduce the advantage of pure performative politics. Perhaps through sortition, random selection of leaders, more robust technocratic checks, or electoral systems that reward consensus building over grandstanding. On a personal level, this understanding should fundamentally alter how we interact with power structures. The key insight is that most hierarchies operate on two parallel sets of rules: the official ones stated in handbooks and manifestos, and the real ones governing actual advancement. The wise individual learns to navigate both without becoming corrupted by the latter. This might mean developing what the ancient Greeks called metis, practical cunning, not to exploit others but to avoid being exploited. It means recognizing when to speak truth to power, rarely, when to keep one's head down, often, and when to exit a corrupt system entirely, sooner than we'd like to admit. The most profound implication, however, is collective rather than individual. If we understand that systems naturally degrade toward folly unless actively prevented from doing so, we must design institutions with this in mind. This means building organizations where transparency makes grandstanding harder, where checks and balances prevent any one fool from causing too much damage, where incentives reward actual results rather than mere performance. The solution to bad leadership isn't better followers, it's better systems. We must create structures where the path to power requires demonstrating actual competence rather than just gaming perceptions, where ethical behavior is rewarded rather than punished, where the costs of foolishness are borne by the foolish rather than by their subordinates. The uncomfortable truth we must finally confront is that fools don't rise despite our systems. They rise because of them. For too long, we've treated this as some inevitable law of nature when in reality it's the product of human decisions. Human designs, human cowardice. Machiavelli's real lesson wasn't that this is how power works. It's that this is how we've chosen to let power work. The transformational call, then, is not to lament this state of affairs but to become architects of better systems. This begins with ruthless self-honesty about our own complicity. Every time we applaud style over substance, every time we excuse bad behavior because that's just how the game is played, every time we stay silent in the face of obvious folly, we place another brick in the fool's throne. The change starts by valuing what actually matters, not the confident answer but the correct one, not the flashy solution but the effective one, not the charismatic leader but the competent one. The good news is that systems can be redesigned, and history shows brief golden ages where wisdom prevailed, usually when societies consciously structured themselves to make folly less rewarding. We stand at a point where we can choose to continue the ancient cycle of foolish rulers and suffering masses, or we can finally build institutions that resist rather than enable this dynamic. The tools are all around us, from technology that enables unprecedented transparency, to psychological insights that help us design better decision-making structures, to historical examples of what actually works. The choice is ours. Will we remain passive observers to the endless parade of fools? Or will we become the generation that finally breaks this ancient curse? The throne awaits, but this time, it could be occupied by wisdom rather than folly. All that's required is the courage to make it so.